He's been a professional storyteller for over 20 years. She's also a librarian in Oakland at the Oakland Public Library. But she tells stories of traditional stories. She's from New Orleans. Her family before that was from the Southern Appalachian Mountains, so she has quite a few stories of those. Some of her stories are available on, I don't know if it's tape or CD, but at August House, if you want to look that up. August House is a publisher of storytelling materials, books, tapes, and so on. So you can look at that. She also has a book out if you're interested. We'll get to the library here, you'll be able to take it out, although probably won't be there for a few weeks. Called The Crash Course in Storytelling, if you're interested in doing any storytelling yourself. She's also the past chairperson of the head of the National Association for the Advancement and Preservation of Storytelling, now called something else.
Yes.
But so she's been active in the storytelling world for years. If you want more information about the storytelling world, so to speak, or to hear more stories, there is an event coming up in late May, the Bay Area Storytelling Festival. And if you search online for that, just Google Bay Area Storytelling Festival, and you'll find information on it. It's right outside of Berkeley, the third weekend in May, I believe. It's a great opportunity to hear a handful, many storytellers. So this story today, I think I'll let Gay introduce it, but it's a true story, and there are important reasons that will become clear why she's telling the story. This is part of Women's History Month. It has to do with women's history, women's rights, women's problems, and so on. But it extends far beyond that. So if you introduce Gay, if you welcome Gay, I'd like to introduce Gay Ducey.
Thank you for coming so early in the morning for college folk. This story, as Doug tells, is true. Indeed, every word of it is true. Every fact, every conclusion, every implication, down to a couple of months ago, it's true. It's all true. March 25th, 1911, 96 years ago this year, was a beautiful, beautiful spring day. Very much like the day we are blessed to have today. A little colder. In New York City, in Manhattan. Beautiful spring day. A Saturday. And in Washington Square, right next to Greenwich Village, everyone on the square had looked out that morning and said, this is a day to be outside. And they were. There were people all over the Central Park, right there in the square, all around the fountain that is still there if you go there today. The fountain was spraying the children who had walked miles, some, and blocks, others, from the tenements on the Lower East Side. New York, even then, didn't have a lot of open space. So that space was precious, precious. There were kids rolling hoops all the way around the sidewalks. Dog walkers, just like today. On one side of the square, close to the north, was a whole line of buildings, beautiful brownstone buildings, and many, many of the wealthy and the prominent and the privileged lived on that side. But not at all far away, the way it is in cities. There was housing for those who were almost the poorest as well. And yet they all met on that square, Washington Square, in 1911. The city coroner was one of those who was on that privileged side. He was just that afternoon packing his bag, thinking that he might do a few last-minute calls to those patients that he still had in the hospital. Or maybe not, for the day beckoned and the light was good. There was a police officer, a mounted police officer, riding a horse, a great big animal, the biggest one in the mounted police, named Yale. He was an irritable horse, easy to upset. So the officer kept the reins tight, just in case a child might run across the path. His name was Officer Meehan. He too was crossing that square. It was 4:40 in the afternoon, just about the time that people began to think about the plans for the evening. Shopkeepers along the other side of the square were sweeping up in front, preparing for the night's activities. Small restaurants and little shops stayed open because sometimes people would come off the line, off the work line, and go in, spend a little money. Lena Goldman was sweeping up right in front of her tiny little restaurant. Dominic Cardione, who owned part of a draying company, was just loading the last of the great big boxes and parcels to go on the dray carts, could pull them out of the way for the work to begin again on Monday. It was a busy day, busy time. On Washington Square, right here, Washington Street, and on Green Street, which made an L, there was a building that towered over that square. It was a triangle shape. And the edge of that triangle was like the prow of a ship marching into that square, the Ash Building. It's there today. And high up in the Ash Building, on floors 8, 9, and 10, was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It was a busy, busy, busy factory. They were in the business of making shirtwaists or blouses. Lots of women had gone to work and they needed apparel that was appropriate for the workplace and also appropriate to go about the town. It was the most coveted garment a woman could own at the time. And it was made out of the finest cloth available. It was called lawn, as thin a cloth as you can find today. And if you were to hold it up against the light, you would see your own hand through it. It was that light and beautiful. A shirtwaist had a tiny little collar, little buttons down the front, sometimes tucks and sometimes a small ruffle. And about here it bloused out and then was drawn in a tight bodice. Sometimes women wore them with a little tiny black tie to show that they were working women, making a living. Everyone wanted one. They were expensive. But at least one a woman could use for a long time, and if she had some wealth, 2 or 3, even 4, because the styles changed, although the shirtwaist remained every year. There was such a demand for those garments that the work week really never ended. Oh, Sunday, people got off. But it was a 6-day work week. So up on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building, women were at work and just beginning to slow down and end the workday. The average work week was 57 hours, mostly women, and almost all of them immigrants. So inside those factories all around the Lower East Side, not just this one, but all of them, you'd hear many languages, just like today. Lots and lots of Jewish immigrants from all over Eastern Europe, and just as many almost Italian immigrants. Most of them very young women, and many of them the sole support of their families. Some of them, the whole family. On that day, around 4:40, women started to finish the day. On the 8th floor, women were sitting around some men. Those men were the cutters. They would take a pattern down from a long wire that ran the length of the shop, which was well over 5,000 feet, and they'd pull a pattern down. The patterns were lined with a little lead, and inside a little sheet of paper, and they'd take down one piece, and put it on a stack of lawn. Lawn, and then paper, and lawn, and paper, a stack. And then they'd cut it with a pattern knife and start the puzzle that ended in a garment. The best of the cutters, and they were the most highly paid, were those who could take that knife and those patterns and get the least waste out of one sheet of lawn. And around them there were many, many assistants. They would start and an assistant would take over. The assistants were almost always women, much less well paid. When they'd finish cutting out, they'd pull up those bits and pieces of what would become a blouse, and they'd take, just like pie crust, and they'd take all the scraps and throw them underneath. They'd built a bin underneath that table to get all the scraps. And once every maybe 6 months, maybe 3 months, someone would come in and take those scraps to the pulping plant. It had been a long time since they had been collected. The setters were there too. Sometimes there were drapers looking at the design, and there were always people running up and down the stairs, up and down the stairs, taking the patterns up to the 9th floor, bringing down a pattern that was wrong, finding 5 yokes to fit 5 cuffs, measuring what was going to be the end of the day, what was going to be the take at the end of the day. It was a very busy factory. And just about the time things closed, instead of slowing down, it speeded up, because they wanted to get as many pieces cut as they could. On the 9th floor were sewing machines, one after another, table after table after table, like a giant field, 278 machines running for 8 to 10 hours a day, women sitting at each one. And it was said that they knew each other so well, and they were so close together, that you could tell if a new woman was at your back by the way she pulled in her chair or pulled it out. They didn't have time to look, but they'd know it was a stranger. If you moved at the wrong time, the chairs would lock. So you had to inch that chair out to get up. Women sewed all day long, but there were also buttonhole sewers, buttonhole makers, there were sleeve setters, there were yoke setters, dozens of different ways of designing and sewing one garment. Beneath that, where the conveyor belt rolled along like this, helping the machines to work, the oil, the hot oil from the machines would drop into a vat below. When they were finished sewing, they would take the finished piece and put it underneath, right at a basket that was right underneath the table and right next to them. Big, big wicker baskets with every person. And if you'd get up at the wrong time, you'd tangle up in those baskets. On the 10th floor, which is the top of the building, were the offices, the salespeople, the 2 owners. Both of them happened to be there that day. Not usually. The names were Harris and Blank. Blank was there with his 2 children. They were going out to the park after. There was someone there taking orders, and someone in between on the 9th floor who would try to call the orders up and down from 8 to 10. She was fiddling with a new piece of equipment, Mary Leventhal, her name was, and she was a perfectionist. She wanted to make that new machine work so that you could write a note and have it hop in the air and land in a little cylinder right on the 10th floor. But she couldn't make it work that day. The bookkeeper was making out the paychecks for the end of the day. To get out of there, and that's what women wanted to do, get out. Saturday night. Time for fun. Time to go home. Time to feed the children. Time to put your feet up and go to bed. Time for a movie. A rare occasion. Time to sit with friends or go into Lena Goldberg's little restaurant. So the sounds of the machines started to slow, and the voices of the women started to rise. They'd call back and forth to each other, good friends, old enemies, the way it is in any working shop. To get out, women had to take their bags and then form a line on each of the floors, 8 and 9, and walk into a little enclosure, flimsy. Once you got there, 2 or 3 women could enter, but only 1 woman at a time could get out, because there was a guard, a kind of a foreman, who opened every purse and searched through it to be sure the women weren't thieving, weren't taking a free shirtwaist, for instance. It slowed down the progress of the women, so the ones who were fastest would get their work done, and at the very second that the bell rang at 4:45, they'd jump up and whip right in there to get to be first in line. Some of them didn't do that. Some went around to the cloakroom and changed clothes. There was a young woman there, her name was Clotilde Turdanova. She was getting married in 2 weeks. And she had a brand new outfit. She was meeting her husband-to-be that night for dinner. So she went right through to change her clothing. You get dirty in a factory, doesn't matter what kind, so women always had to change, but some wanted to get out fast. As the women began to do that, they talked back and forth. One of them said, "Where are you going?" The other one said, "I'm meeting my young man." Another one said, "I'm going home to the children." And 3 or 4 of them had planned to go to a special show. It was called Madame Sherry. And it was the most popular show on Broadway. Cost a lot of money. It was a lot of money to them. And they began to sing the songs right there in the work setting. So bits of melody floated across. The favorite song was called "Every Little Movement Has a Meaning of Its Own." And as these young voices rose, the other women started to file into the funnel to get out the door. On the 9th floor, you'd have to stop your machine, make sure that nothing was caught in the needle. It was a little slower there. And on the 10th floor, they had already started to pack up. The 10th floor had one way up onto the roof. Hard to get in, though. Hard to get out. They didn't like workers to come up the passenger elevators down on the 1st floor of the Ash building. It didn't look right to have workers, immigrants. They didn't like it. So passengers went up to other businesses from floor 1, the ground floor, all the way up to the 7th floor. 2 tiny little elevators for passengers were there, 2 young men. One named Gaspar Moldinado, he ran the elevator to the right. And his friend, a good friend, was next to him. And they would take people up who were doing business. But around on the other corner, on the green side, there was a freight elevator, not the kind we know, not as big. Women were told, and men, to go around the corner where you couldn't be seen and go up. And when they got to the factory floor, they'd go in. No one would really see them. Not really. Outside, as the day waned and the lights began to come up, just the beginning of them, Lena Goldman was sweeping and finishing the sweeping in front of her store. Dominic Cardione had just loaded the last of the great big parcels to be delivered on the dray carts, and he was pulling the dray cart out, a stubborn animal pulling him out by the bit, and they heard a sharp report. Not quite like a gun, they said later, but a sharp, harsh sound. And everyone in the square, child to adult, looked up to see what it was. Because they knew that factory. They knew it well. It wasn't but a year before that the end of an enormous strike called the Shirtwaist Strike had filled the square and the streets of the Lower East Side with 20,000 women who were trying to get higher wages and safety in the workplace. Trying. The strike was a vicious, vicious strike. Women were beaten to the ground many times. And at the end of that strike, enough of the shops around the square and the Lower East Side settled with those workers, began to settle, began to think about raising wages, treating properly what should have been a foregone idea. But 2 or 3, maybe more, 10 or 15, we'll never know the answer to that, didn't settle. And one of them, the most resistant, the most harsh, was the Triangle Factory. And when the women went back to work, they came back to work grudgingly, and the owners were grudging at having them back. So when that report happened, every eye turned to what they knew was an unsafe building. They knew it. People said later, we were just waiting for that fire, just waiting for it. Lena Goldman looked up. She couldn't see anything except a tiny wisp, a puff of smoke, enough so that you'd think if you were big enough you could blow it into the clouds. And then a parcel, a great big bolt of cloth, fell out of the 8th floor and tumbled over and over, aflame. People along the square said, "Fire, it's a fire." And as soon as he heard that shout from down below, the city coroner, Dr. Winterbottom, took the bag, and without a moment's hesitation, not knowing what would happen, he opened the door, told his wife that there'd be no dinner, and started at a dead run across the square. When the bolt got about to the 4th or 5th, maybe 3rd, they saw the first part of a long and dreadful story. For from the 3rd or the 4th floor, the people in the square looked down and saw the bolt of cloth burst into flame, and then saw that it had legs and feet. It was a woman. And she came down like a comet onto the pavement below. It didn't take Officer Meehan on Yale more than moments to spur his horse across that square, dismount, and start to get in. But by that time, the fire was well underway. On the 8th floor, the women were still in the funnel waiting to get out. And they saw the fire and thought it was a small one. The foreman, his name was Berman, he worked those women hard. He worked them very hard. He was tough on those women, but he was also a courageous man, and he was just as tough on them to get them out of there. He took some of the pails, 3 or 4, not many, about this deep, filled with water, and he ran over to douse the fire. And to his astonishment, the fire wasn't even touched, not touched. All of the patterns above started to wave in the breeze that fire was creating. Small at first, near the Green Street side, just beginning, but strong and hungry, very hungry. The Green Street side ended right at the corner, and below and down on the back side of that building was an enclosure, a cement enclosure. No windows except in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, but you'd look down on it and see that it ended in a cement yard. That's where the fire escape was. The fire escape had been put up, in a manner of speaking, but the shutters from all of the floors opened out, iron shutters. So if you opened the shutters, you blocked on every floor a way to get to that fire escape. The fire escape, they say, was so loose that you could hear it in the wind sometimes. So women didn't go there first. They rushed on the 8th floor over to the corner where the freight elevator was and the stairs. The other side, toward the passenger elevators, they didn't go at first. They didn't know to go. That was where the business people went. And they rushed to the stairs. Many of them tumbled through and started down the stairs, screaming, screaming. The fire chasing them right down the stairs already. When that happened, the women in the middle and the men saw and didn't know whether to go to the back, to the fire escape, to the side, to the freight elevator, down the stairs, or try over here for the 2 elevators for the passengers and the narrow stairs. The stairs were no wider than this. There were 200, 300, 350 people working that day in those 3 floors. In those 3 floors. Some of the women saw that there was a jam of bodies already. The sides of the windows, much taller than this, were already aflame, because if you built a building and kept it at 135 feet, then you wouldn't have to make metal window frames. If you raised it to 150, then it had to be metal. It was one of the shortcuts that the designer had made, you see. A shortcut. They knew that, and when the windows started to burn so quickly, some of the women and the men started toward the passenger elevators. They got to the door in a jam of bodies and screaming and howling and pulling and tugging and tried to open the door, but it was locked. Locked fast. And it opened into the shop. Berman started to fight his way through the women, pushing them aside, throwing them back, picking them up and hauling them away to get to the door, saying, "Ladies, let me through, just let me through, just let me through here." When he got there, it was locked. He found a key, heavens knows how, somewhere. And he fought back, opened the door, and opened it. And when he did, a rush of women went through. The young men in the elevators down below heard the screaming. And without thinking a moment, not a moment's hesitation, they raised the elevators up right away and opened the doors. Each elevator only took 10 people. And there were 20, 30, 40, 50 women who flooded through that small entry to get there. A young woman there, her name was Jette Lubitz. You could set a clock by Jette. They called her Tick-Tock, behind her back, because she was the first person to put that time card in. And she was the last person to pull it out to get an extra moment or two on that time card. And in the midst of these women desperately trying to move here, get out, she carefully pulled her time card out of her pocket, and walking through all the women with the smoke beginning to fill the room, she made her way slowly toward the time clock and slipped it in, and then carefully pulled it out, put it back in her pocket, and as she turned, the back of her skirt was aflame. That was the 8th floor. Down below, as people saw women starting, the ones who escaped, flood down the lower floors, they had already called in the alarm, already. New York was very proud of its fire department. They had 39 pieces of equipment, many of them motorized, a new idea, and very efficient. And even if you didn't know the fire had started, you would have heard it all over the Lower East Side. For the whine and howl of the bells and the sirens and the clanging was everywhere. And people followed by the hundreds, every one of those pieces of equipment, flowing down through the Lower East Side, tiny, tiny streets, twisted little alleys, all the way to Washington Square. There were 10,000 people there in a matter of minutes. Everyone knew what had happened. One of the people below, William Shepard, he was an unemployed journalist, a freelancer, worked for United Press. He was the second man on the scene. He was a journalist in every part of his body and soul, and he pulled out a little tiny bit of a pencil, stub really, and a little bitty, tiny, 3 or 4 sheets of paper. And he started to write as he ran. He wrote everything that he saw. It was the one first-person account that was reliable the day after that fire. And as he wrote and ran, he looked up, and he saw a woman standing inside a window frame. Behind her, she was lit by the flames that teased and touched and nudged her off that ledge. Next to her was another woman pulling herself up. Then women filled all of the windows along the side, Washington side, Green side, and the people below, men and women, thousands of them, yelled up, "Don't jump! Wait, they're coming! Don't jump, they're coming!" The sound lost in the air. And yet they could hear the bells. And so they waited, some of them leaning out, holding on, as if somehow, if they leaned out far enough, they could see salvation below and fall into its arms. But it was not so. It was not so. When the first equipment came through, they had to fight their way through the people already gathered. The men with the dray carts and wagons had pulled them around and held out big tarps, huge ones, men all the way around them holding on, so that if a woman jumped, they could run it over to catch her. The first woman who jumped held out her hand like this, and in her hand was a handful of coins, and she flung the coins out as if to give her earthly wealth to someone. She was dead on the pavement before the coins hit. A second woman nodded her head, looked back as if she was speaking with someone, but only the fire. And she took a hat, brand new it looked to be, the great soft feather, and flung it out into the crowd as if to save it for someone else. And then, protecting her skirts for modesty, trying to hold them down, she jumped. A man stepped out. Shepherds saw him. He said you could tell he was a gentleman. He was helping them to a decent death, a better death. He would lean back in the window holding on and pull the woman up, and holding an arm around her, talk to her, wipe the tears. And then, at last, she would nod, and by the elbows he would hold her out and let her go. Woman after woman stepped up, until the man was aflame himself, and then his own lover stepped with him. You could tell. They put their arms around each other. He smoothed her hair. She patted him. And then they stepped out into eternity, keeping their arms close as they fell. And then women began to fall too fast for anyone to count them. The tarps below suddenly held up. Women's bodies fell directly through them. There were too many. Men were scattered like bees. The wagons broke. And they fell. And they fell. And they fell. They fell like flowers in a deadly breeze. They fell like candles aflame. There were so many of them that they broke through the glass tiles in the cement, and the bodies fell below into the basements underneath. The street was red. When the fire department had come to save them, they had raised the ladders as fast as a man can raise them, climbed up them, and told the women to wait. But the ladders only reached to the 6th floor. And some women would see those 2 floors and think, I can do it. One leapt out with her hands ready to catch it, tangled in the last moment in the ladder, and then let go. They were the lucky ones. They were. On the 9th floor, as the women started to fill the windows, the exits started to close off. Because on the 9th floor, no one told them that the fire was coming. The equipment which was supposed to be able to send a message up failed immediately. And so one of the foremen, ran up to the 9th floor, but the flames beat him back. Another man tried to crawl along the stairway, and the smoke beat him back. And while the 8th floor burned, the 9th floor was just beginning to slow the machines. A woman looked out, and she saw the smoke and flame come up the window on the Green Street side, and she's the one who announced the fire. They could hear people screaming below. Women rushed to the windows, and they're the ones who jumped. Others ran directly to the fire escape. It was never meant for more than a dozen people. And dozens and dozens and dozens of people tried to climb on each other to get down on that fire escape. The fire escape began to twist and to groan and to protest. The fire escape ended 2 stories above the ground. Cost-saving measure. And yet they went on it. They held on until at last it began to twist its way loose from the building, and the women standing to get on stopped and backed up. They tried to get in the line to get on the 2 little elevators, which had gone up and down as many times as these heroic men could bring them, with the cables scorching and burning. With the screams of women in their ears, they went up and down at great risk to themselves. And when the tiny doors would open, women would flood in. They couldn't close the doors. They would hold each other in, and then the little elevators would go down and up and down, the stairs burning and scorching, both ones. And yet they went. Soon it was the only way to go out on the 9th floor. And so women looked, saw the fire behind them. It was not a fire, it was a storm of flame, because lawn, that faint, light, handkerchief-light fabric, is more combustible than paper. And all of those tiny bits would leap out of the bins and float along and drop seeds of fire everywhere. In 3 minutes, that floor was engulfed. The last 2 trips in the elevator, women threw themselves on the top of the elevator. They could see the cable scorching, and they plunged onto the roof of the elevator. And the women inside would try to hold on to them to get them to the bottom, for they had pulled off the ceiling and could see straight up. One woman got almost all of herself in. Her feet and legs were out, hitting each floor as it went by, and yet she said, "I was alive at the bottom." The last woman to go on said, "I don't know how I lived. I don't know what I did. I don't know. I threw myself out into the air, and a woman's hand came out. She saved my life. I don't know who she was. I don't know." It's a young woman whose name was Cohen, Rose Cohen. She had spent all her salary on a muff, a tiny little circle of fur that you could put your hands in on a cold day and tuck them away. It was her prized possession, and she had it with her. She was the last one to make it out alive down the elevators. She looked up, she saw the scorching cable, and she took the muff and put her hands in and put it on the cable and rode the cable down as the muff burned till she got to the bottom. On the 10th floor, Blank and his 2 children stood in the center and did nothing. He was paralyzed. He had heard about the fire. He saw the flames coming up the stairs, for now the flames had taken out much of the staircase on the Washington side. And, of course, the stairs on the Green side were going quickly. Some of the women came from 8 and 9, ran up those stairs instead of down, and saved their lives. But they didn't have long. They had to decide like that. As the stairs began to burn, some very clever women, or lucky, took a bolt of cloth of lawn, and standing like dancers, they rolled themselves around and around and around and around and around in it until they were like shrouds covered with the cloth, and ran up the stairs. And as the lawn burned away and burned away, they made it as the cloth burned, and emerged like a chrysalis, like a butterfly. The ceiling of the 10th floor had one small place where you could get to the roof through a little trap door, and then an opening outside that. The people on the 10th floor, who fared reasonably well, knew that and started to punch out as fast as they could that little trap and open it up to get to the door. But that building, the Ash Building, was 2 stories below the building next to it, which is NYU, and remains so today. And as luck would have it, there had been painters at NYU the week before, and they'd left the ladders. They just left them. So there were 2 ladders available to get away from the building and up. Class was in session that day. A horticulture class taught by Professor Parsons and Professor Summers. And they were teaching with their backs to the window and looked and saw the faces of their students and turned to see a vision from hell. People emerging out of hell's very mouth. Aflame, dirty, torn, and bloody. They jumped through the large windows. The students and the professors ran across and hauled people out, up the ladders and away. One of the men who worked there said that he stumbled over a body on his way up. He reached down and thought, maybe she's alive. She had long, long, bright red hair. And he wound the hair around his arm and held on and dragged the woman out and flung her on the roof, and she sat up. Down below, as the bodies began to pile up, and as the day began to slow and wane, the square was now filled with 20,000 people. No one knew who was alive or who was dead, and they would not know for a very long time to come. They pushed forward and were pressed back, pushed forward, were pressed back, and they waited. The hoses reached up, but not far enough. They took out some of the fire on the 8th floor, hardly touched the 9th. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The fire was contained in 13 minutes. The site was secured and rescue begun in 25 minutes. 25. There were not enough coffins for the dead. They had brought all they could, knowing that they would need them. And the strangest of all the stories is that the sound that night, here and there, was the sound of sawing as they threw together rude wooden coffins as fast as they were able to contain the dead. Firefighters stopped and tried to find and help those who had escaped. The women streaming down the stairs, the women coming from the elevators, many of them dreadfully injured, and some untouched. Several of them still holding their purses. One woman fell the last floor somehow, and she fell to the ground. They picked her up, and broken as she was, she got up, straightened her garments, walked across the street to the park, turned around, and died. Right then. There were survivors, of course. Some of them simply walked away. They hardly knew what had happened. But some of them saw sights that they reported later to the newspaper. And one of them, a young woman not more than 18 years old, had been on the 9th floor in the center at her machine. She was fast and young and frightened and desperate, and she stepped up with her big skirts And she walked right across the top of those tables to get to that elevator. She was the sole support of her family. Her father was disabled. She had to get out. She fought her way. Her name was Ethel. And she said that as the exits closed and the chances to escape stopped, women cried. They called out the names of their children on the 9th floor. They spoke the names of their mothers. They spoke to their own gods. And then they were gone. One of the young women who had escaped, her name was Josephine Nicolosi. She walked all the way home, miles, miles, and miles. She had looked as if she'd been beaten badly. Her clothing was torn. Her flesh burned some. It was a modest age. To show an ankle was an important and odd thing to do. And with your clothing torn, people on the street would rush up and help you, cover you up. By the strangest of chances, she passed a barber shop, and her own father was in there, getting a Saturday shave and a haircut. He had on a barber's drape, and he was looking out from the big barber's chair, looking out on the street, and he saw his daughter wander down the center of the road. No one knew what had happened that far away. She looked like someone had beaten her. That was his oldest and most treasured child, and he ran out in a rage, and he pulled that drape off, and he took it, and he started to whip that girl back and forth and said, "Who did that to you? Who did it to you? Show me who did this. What man did this?" And she stopped. She said, "Tutti morti, Papa. Tutti morti. They are all dead." Isidore Godiner, young man with a father who worked in the factory, they always went home together. Their mother was a fearful woman, always afraid something was going to happen to someone. They lived in what was called a cold water flat, no hot water, carrying the buckets in, 3 rooms, 1, 2, 3, and 2 small children, and Isidore the oldest. He couldn't find his father. He couldn't find him. He didn't speak much English, and his father spoke only Yiddish. So he went to the hospitals to find him. He went to the morgue, which had been set up on the spot. He couldn't find him. He went home on the L, and he couldn't get out. He couldn't tell her. So he rode back, and he rode forth, and he rode back, twice, 3 times. And on the 3rd trip, sitting, his pants legs torn, his face burned, he walked out and decided to go back again, see if he could find someone who knew more English. And there was his father. He said later, "My father was a small, quiet, dignified man. He always wore the only suit he'd ever owned to work, wore a hat. And he was sitting with his legs together, waiting for something, alive, alive." Those who were injured were taken to the hospitals where they asked for what they needed, or sometimes couldn't ask. They tried to get translators to come in for those who only spoke Italian or Yiddish. One young woman, when she arrived there, gravely, gravely injured, asked for one thing. She asked for 2 books to read in Yiddish, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. She said, "If I can have those books, I can survive." She was a young student at night in the night school. Once the bodies were in the coffins, such as they were, they began to gather up the bits and pieces of humanity. It is hard to hear this, but it is the truth. They could hardly be seen as human beings. There was no way to recognize almost any of them. Some. And so All of the people tried to gather up the bits, a hair ribbon, the sole of a shoe, a handbag, a photograph, anything that had fallen that could later become the way to identify a loved one. And they carefully boxed them, and along with the dead, they were carried off to where the dead were laid out. It was called Charity Pier, but its name among everyone in the whole city was not that official name. It was called Misery Lane, because it had taken the dead from the Slocum ship fire years before. Misery Lane it was. The great, big pier gates were locked tight, opened to receive the dead and then locked again, but all over the city. A time when there was almost no way to communicate except word of mouth, everyone knew. And by the time midnight came, it is hard to believe, 100,000 people were at Misery Lane waiting. Just as they had at the fire, they pushed forward and pulled back and pushed forward against the police. Every available policeman was there, locked to keep people away until they were ready. And at midnight, they opened the pier doors. What had been a crowd ready to rush through, some curiosity seekers, many family members, some of them who didn't know who was there or not. They started to rush, and then, strangely enough, they stopped. They began to step backward and step backward, as if the enormity suddenly had appeared and the door had opened to show it. 146 coffins. 146 loved ones. A tiny, tiny woman came first. She was already dressed all in black. Old woman, in those days, old was 40, ancient was 60. She came forward with a rosary already in her hand, but a straight glance. She looked up at the police and the coroner, and she said, "I'm here to get my Rosie. I'm here to get my girl. Let me in. I'm not afraid." They had tried to place the people who were least disfigured at the front, and the worst far down Misery Lane at the end of the pier. She was by herself. No one came after her. She walked, looked over, walked, looked over, shook her head. She didn't avert her eyes. She made the sign of the cross many times. And at last, 2/3 of the way through, she stopped. "That's my Rosie." The person who'd let her down very respectfully said, "How do you know?" She said, "I braided that hair this morning. That's my girl. I've come for my girl." One after the other, in small groups or singly, people came to claim their dead. One family despaired of finding the girl that they had sent that morning until they saw a foot with a shoe, and the repair on the bottom was one that her father had made by himself. He knew her. Endlessly through the night, the next day, and the following day, people came to claim their dead. And yet at the end, there were 7 bodies unclaimed. Number 7, number 9, number 141, number 143, number 129, number 87, and number 96. No one to claim them. In the Jewish tradition, as you probably well know, burial comes quickly and should. It must come quickly. And so the business of death began, the busy time of burial. Rabbis must be summoned. Bodies must be cleansed. People must be invited to sit shiva, to mourn. And there were so many funerals on the Lower East Side that in front of each funeral, a man would walk with a sign, and it would say, "This is the funeral of Emma Goldman," because there might be 4 Goldman funerals that day. He would walk ahead to be sure that the mourners knew which victim to mourn that day. The fire did not go unnoticed. The very next day, every paper was filled. There were special editions in every paper on the East Coast. In Russia, it was front page news. In Pittsburgh, it was front page news. Everywhere where the needle trades and women in factory conditions had an interest, it was in the paper for days and days and days. And just as it is always true in the dreary and predictable way of human beings, that's what it took for them to begin to open the doors and take a look. On Wednesday, after the Saturday fire, there was a meeting in a town hall in Manhattan. It was filled. People sat on each other's laps. People sat on the floor, and around it stood for hours at a time a memorial service for the dead and the dying, led by the IGLWU, the International Women's Ladies Garment Union, to talk about what to do in memory of these ones. There was a tiny woman there. She was about 4'11". She had red hair and green eyes, and she looked like a fire herself. Her name was Rose Schneiderman. And she walked up to that podium, and they had to put a little platform for her to step up. And she put her little fist right on the podium, and she said, "I don't have time for you. I don't have the time for this. I don't have time for you people who are so well-meaning. You're the ones who were supposed to help us fix this before. But we know that the only people we can trust for workers are workers themselves. I don't have the time to mourn. We'll mourn later. We'll organize now. You good people, weeping your tears, are worth nothing to us. We will take care of our own." She was followed by speaker after speaker. The mayor came. The vice mayor came. The head of Tammany Hall came. Anything to get on the right side of a wrong thing. The mayor said, "We will change this now. We'll make sure it never happens again." And the people who were the relatives of those stood up and booed many a speaker off that stage. It wasn't long before every office holder's career was at risk. And perhaps for that reason, or perhaps for the better reason of knowing that it was more than time, they formed what is called the Factory Investigating Commission. There's a woman who was a part of that commission. She was an unusual woman. She was the first later to be the first Secretary of Labor in the history of the United States. She was the first woman to ever hold a cabinet position. And she said, "What are we going to do on this commission exactly?" And they said, "Well, we're going to study what happened." She said, "Oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think what we're going to do is go in every single factory, unlock every door, go in every sweatshop, and we're going to look in that box in the corner where they keep the children who are under 10 years old who work in the factories. And every time someone comes in, they throw the children in the box and cover it up so nobody knows they're working. I think we're going to look at those. And they did. In the first year that the Factory Investigating Commission had been created and charged, 12 pieces of legislation passed like a comet through the state legislature. The following year, 14 pieces of legislation passed. And the year after, almost as many. And here are some of the things that they did. Everyone would have the benefit of a door that opens out. A small matter, but it cost 49 women their lives. Everyone who worked in a factory would not find a door that was locked. Everyone in the factory would have the benefit of a sprinkler system, not just those above a certain level. Everyone would have some precaution to get out in time. Those were large pieces of legislation, and yet they went through like knife through butter. And they began to implement them as quickly as they could. And so the world of labor began to change. But not before there was a trial for Blank and Harris. It was a nasty trial. It was an expensive trial. They hired, of course, the most expensive attorney they could find. He had an unblemished record of successes and wins. Every other attorney in the city said, let's place a side bet. I can't imagine anyone winning this trial. The prosecution had had someone sort through, in the grim task of sorting through every piece of debris on 3 floors, finding loved ones still sitting at the machines on the 9th floor, skeletonized and sitting where they had never even had time to get up. But in the course of that grim and grisly business, on the 9th floor, right where the funnel was, at the door, they found a giant lock as big as my fist, blackened and still working from the locked door locked on the outside on that floor. When they saw the lock, the other attorneys said, glad I didn't take that one. The Ash building was back in business very quickly. It wasn't harmed at all. It was ready for a new tenant within a month. After all, the building was secure and strong. It's just the human flesh that burned, and the cloth, and the wood. They were already 2 or 3 days later beginning to sweep it out, shine it up, repaint it. It's still there, and it's still sturdy. The testimony from the trial, which I read page by page, says things like, I went in, I put in my time card, and I told my mother I'd be back at 6 o'clock. And I did. But I was the only one in my row. It said things like, I always wondered how we'd get out. Now I know. It was devastating testimony. But the judge happened to have had a bit of trouble himself, a spot of difficulty that blotted his own reputation. And on the day that the jury came back with the findings, both men were acquitted of all charges. Every charge. During that period of time, people in Russia, people in Germany, people in Latvia, Lithuania, sometimes got small, unexpected pieces of mail. Just as the trial was going on, an old man in Bialystok in Russia saw, to his amazement, a letter from the United States written in a hand that was not his daughter's. When he opened it up, rubles fell out on the ground. It was the money for his daughter's life. He didn't know she was dead until he got the money. For in between the fire and the recovery and the funerals, all that time, prominent women in particular, and prominent men, had marshaled the resources that only the privileged can monitor and make sure get talked with and money gets spent. All of those people had marshaled their resources and had provided all manner of goods and services to every single family and every single survivor. But the two men chiefly responsible walked away. It is said that Blank became obsessed with locks for the rest of his life. He spent his whole life, which was long, continually trying to demonstrate that the lock would really have opened if someone had been smart enough to know how. He fiddled with them all the time. He never gave up his own defense, even though he was acquitted. A week after the fire, there was a memorial service in Washington Square. 350,000 people came. They walked through the streets of the Lower East Side, where every house had a black ribbon across the door, and every arm had a band of black. First, just a few, women in the front in great black hats and long black garments, carrying signs that said, "We will mourn our own dead." They walked in the front, Rose Schneiderman right in the center. Frances Perkins, later to be the labor secretary, right next to her. And they walked through the Lower East Side, and as people saw them coming, they opened the doors and they flowed out, some of them still with a napkin and their lunches about them, and joined that group, which swelled to 350,000, and they didn't make a single sound, not one, until they came to the square and the rain opened and the heavens cracked and they were soaked in a moment. And there was the burned out building, all 3 floors, daylight straight through them. And from that crowd, there came a howl of grief, a howl of grief. And they said together, "No more, not again." One sign said, "No more locked doors." And so it ends. 146 women, several men, dozens of families, endless grief, long history. And yet, in 1991, in Hamlet, North Carolina, 10 people died in a fire because the doors were locked in a poultry processing plant. In November of 2006, in India, an apparel factory, 25 people died because the doors were locked. In 2000, a toy company employing children as young as 8 or 9 years old, 15 people died in fires because the doors were locked. So the laws are in place, my friends, and the dead have been mourned, and now it's up to you. You need to open those doors. You need to make sure that the doors are open the next time you put on your garment that says China, or your garment that says India, or your garment that says Bangladesh. You might ask yourself what the cost will be to some child, some factory, behind some locked door. That's the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.